From the rise of the meat industry to the invention of canned goods, the changes and innovation in food production have drastically altered people's diets. Over time, the human palate has evolved, and in some ways, what we eat is indicative of a certain period. Take World War I, for example, when items like beef, pork, butter, and cane sugar were rationed, and Americans cut down on decadent dishes. Families swapped in poultry or fish to get protein, and instead of wheat flour, relied on rye, oat, or potato flour as a starch. Today, food instability is once again front and center as millions struggle to afford the rising cost of groceries due to the pandemic. From February to June of this year, the Bureau of Economic Analysis reported that the price of beef shot up 20%. And it's not just meat. On average, staples like eggs, fresh vegetables, and grains all cost more compared to last year. More families are looking closer at the cost of groceries and making decisions about what and what not to buy. Instead of fresher, pricier picks, some are turning to canned goods, frozen foods, and cheaper grains to get by. Historian Jane Ziegelman finds these forced shifts in American diets to be especially interesting. Ziegelman is a food writer and the co-author of the book A Square Meal, A Culinary History of the Great Depression. She spent much of her career studying the evolution of American cuisine and how people's eating habits have changed with the times. She takes us back to the era of Prohibition, starting in the early 1920s, and points to how the ban of alcohol influenced food.
What you couldn't do with liquor, maybe you could do with food. There was a lot of sort of fanciful food consumption.
During this time, in a post-World War I era without the need to ration, Ziegelman says Americans flocked to sugar. These over-the-top dishes were showcased in popular ladies' magazines of the time, like Good Housekeeping. Take the rise of elaborate Jell-O creations, for instance.
They were colored gelatins, usually lime or lemon, with all kinds of vegetables in them, and sometimes meats, and they were molded. And then sometimes the fruits or vegetables that were incorporated into them were themselves cut into shapes and plated in very sort of decorative ways, according to, let's say, the Christmas theme or a spring picnic. People were really interested in cooking thematically. It was sort of the heyday of the color-coordinated dinner. So people would throw yellow dinners and orange dinners and pink dinners, and these Jell-O salads were a great way of introducing these tremendous bursts of color into the table. So a lot of the appeal of these foods was visual, and I don't think it really mattered all that much what they tasted like.
But this way of looking at food quickly dissipated with the onset of the Great Depression.
The idea that because our funds were limited, we had to choose really judiciously what we were eating according to its nutritional content. So it's the beginning of when you see the nutrition content on packaging. And that's when you would make your choice about whether to buy A or B, depending on what its vitamin content or mineral content would be.
For millions struggling to get by, ingredients like sugar and meat were seen as a luxury and out of the budget. Families turned to stocking their kitchen shelves with cheap grains and legumes with the sole intention of keeping hunger at bay.
The 1930s was the decade of the bean. Navy beans, baked beans, lima beans, bean loaves, and loaves in general were a category of food that were very prominent. And the idea is that it was nutritious and that it was very economical, and also that it was a way to eat beans without the kind of stigma of putting beans on the table, because beans were very much seen as a poor person's food.
Another common pantry staple during this period? Peas. Ziegelman says that pea soup was one of the few soups that Americans really excelled in.
There's an old saying, poor people cook with a lot of water. And that was very much the case during the Depression, when a lot of homemakers rediscovered soups The pea soup is one soup that we really know how to make well, and that's because we use that bone, that ham bone. But there are many soups, sort of classic American soups, that don't take advantage of bones. And the bone, a marrow bone or any kind of bone, is really the secret of a fantastic broth.
One category that Americans are well known for is the classic casserole. In fact, you may have just had a green bean casserole with green beans, cream of mushroom soup, and fried onions for Thanksgiving. However, Ziegelman says that this variation actually traces back to the 1950s. Rewind further back to the 1930s, and casseroles focused on less favorable meats that were cheaper.
One of the benefits of a casserole is that you could hide things in it. And something that Americans didn't like at the time, and really don't like still, are things like heart and liver and kidneys and sweetbreads and all of these sort of organ meats and extremities. The idea was that you could sort of pack them up in a casserole and cover them over with breadcrumbs. And it was also a really good way to cut down on dishwashing time for exhausted homemakers who maybe were working for the first time in their lives and doing homemaking duty. So it had all of these advantages. You know, it's the one-dish meal.
And some casseroles also included noodles, but in combinations many today would find surprising. Ziegelman recalls a magazine recipe that outlined how to make a macaroni and oyster casserole, in which canned oysters were placed on the bottom of the dish and tender macaroni covered the top. But the pasta of the past wasn't like how we cook the carb nowadays. There was no concept of firm pasta or al dente. Instead, many recipes on the back of pasta boxes said to boil for a whopping 30 minutes. And by then the pasta was probably as soft as butter. In whole, the American palate preferred mild flavorings. Nothing was overly spiced or seasoned. Many common recipes focused on creaminess that was achieved through butter and milk, and sometimes a sprinkling of herbs.
The thing about these, like what we might call bland flavors, to the American of that period, it was a mild flavor. Bland, has that connotation of being sort of boring and not appetizing, but a mild flavor has a connotation of being sort of sophisticated and a really heavily seasoned food. And there's a lot of ethnic bias in this, and I realize that, a lot of ethnic/racial bias, but a heavily seasoned food is sort of coarse and lowbrow. A mild food is, what the French do. They use really delicate seasonings and cream and butter and maybe a hint of tarragon. So that was the kind of, French cooking was sort of the gold standard that people were shooting for when they aspired to cook kind of more ambitiously.
And this preference in American cuisine continued on through the 20s and 30s.
The 1930s is still before America discovered what some people call our ethnic cuisines. Things like Italian food and Chinese food, although Chinese restaurants had some popularity, people were not cooking Chinese food in their homes, and they didn't have things like soy sauce in their cupboards as a kind of regular condiment. We didn't use a lot of garlic. I'm talking about sort of mainstream America, not the sort of ethnic communities. And we didn't have a taste for hot foods, for anything with chili. So that was true of the 20s, and it was true of the teens, and it was true of the decade before that as well.
Ziegelman says it wasn't until after World War II, when veterans returning back to the States from places like Italy brought back some new spices and practices into American homes. However, during the 20s and 30s, the mild flavorings dominated recipes. And what did Americans drink to wash down all of those creamy casseroles and dense pea loaves? Milk, of course.
Milk was it was called nature's most perfect food. So no meal should be free of milk. You would drink milk, but you were also eating milk.
The liquid ingredient was exceptionally popular and was consumed by the glass or used in a variety of dishes, from the sauces in pastas to any kind of baked good. In addition to milk, scientists also developed a cheap dietary supplement that Americans could have to get more nutrients.
It was invented by Cornell University called Milk Corno. It was sort of like the protein powders that people stir into their smoothies today. It was a kind of supplement, a nutritional supplement. I think that the idea of the nutritional supplement was born in the Great Depression, and the whole way of evaluating food in terms of its nutritional building blocks is still very much with us. It's not a way of looking at food holistically. It's really a kind of breaking down of food into its chemical parts. So it's for good and for ill. That is what I see as really the great legacy of the Great Depression.
To find out more about American diets during this time, check out Jane Ziegelman's book, A Square Meal, A Culinary History of the Great Depression, available online and in stores. If you're interested in any of her other publications, she recommends also checking out 97 Orchard, an edible history of 5 immigrant families in one New York tenement. You can learn more about Ziegelman, the history of American cuisine, and also find archives of past shows at viewpointsradio.org. To get more behind the scenes, follow Viewpoints Radio on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. This segment was written and produced by Amira Zaveri. I'm Gary Price.
As many as 89% of hospitalized COVID-19 patients are at risk of a complication called cytokine storm, a leading cause of COVID death. But there's good news. Hospitals across the U.S. are enrolling patients in a trial evaluating lenzilumab, an investigational treatment designed specifically to stop this storm, even with only 1 day of treatment. Dr. Cameron Durant, CEO of Humanigen, the company developing lenzilumab.
Having a therapeutic that can significantly reduce the time to recovery from COVID-19 and send patients home earlier could dramatically impact the arc of this pandemic.
Participating in the study means access to a potential treatment option in addition to standard of care therapies. Trial participant Mark Baranski shares his experience.
I don't know if I received lenzilumab or not, but I viewed the trial as doing everything I could for my recovery while contributing to the fight against COVID-19. I certainly encourage others to do the same.
To learn more and find this trial near you, visit StopStorm.com. That's StopStorm.com.
And that's Viewpoints for this week. Viewpoints is a production of MediaTrax Communications. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram to learn more about upcoming shows and find a library of past programs on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, and Spotify. Plus, you'll always find previous segments and more information about our guests at viewpointsradio.org. Join us again next week for another edition of Viewpoints.
Coming up on Viewpoints.
He's often drawn as half genius, half jerk from birth. That's not accurate.
The lasting legacy of the late Steve Jobs. Then,
most of us revert to some sort of what we call an adapter. It's a little nervous gesture that we use, a self-soothing gesture like rubbing your fingertips together.
What signs do you show when you're feeling tense or telling a lie? I'm Marty Peterson.
And I'm Gary Price. These stories in depth on your public affairs magazine, Viewpoints.